Welcome to the 4D Talks, a series of brainstorm sessions with people who perceive architecture beyond the 3 dimensions. The goal of these meetings is to discuss what this 4th dimension of architecture can be and how much it impacts the built environment and the users of the space. Today we will talk about, one could say quite an abstract topic, but I already know that there are fascinating links between architecture and this special field. We're going to talk about games. And for this episode, I invited 2 experts analyzing these relationships, but from 2 different perspectives. Dafne Wiegers, architect and partner at architecture office AHH based in Amsterdam, who is interested in the digital aspect of games. So, for instance, how computer games can influence the design and the other way around. And on the other hand, there has been a huge research done by the anthropologist Melanie van der Hoorn on the analog aspect of games and relationships between board games and architecture. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
So in order to get people on board with us on that whole topic, I would like to start finding the links between games and architecture. So what games can actually teach us, and which games are we talking about here that teach us something about architecture, about urbanism, about the world? How did this topic even start for both of you?
For me, the link between especially video games and architecture is that they're both a very spatial experience, right? So you, as a player or as a person, you walk through a spatial experience that somebody created. So there, being a game designer and being an architect, it's very much the same. Some physical games have that spatial quality too, like Dolls Houses. And what you see now is that there's a lot of media influencing each other. Like an example, The Witcher, you first had a book, that was adapted to tabletop role-playing games, video game, TV series. So there's media influencing each other. Or Minecraft, that is a digital game inspired by Lego. And now there's Lego with a Minecraft theme. So you have this cross-pollination between different media and different forms of culture. And I think now video games are also starting to influence physical architecture.
That's, I think, the topic, a bigger topic that I would then like to tackle a little bit later. And what about the analog games? What can we learn from them actually about architecture or about urbanism?
Regarding the analog games, there are roughly, I would say, 3 genres that are clearly connected to architecture. The first are the Dolls Houses. That's one of the oldest game genres existing. The earliest Dolls Houses appeared at the end of the 17th century. And if you watch Dolls Houses through all those centuries, they actually form quite a reflection of architecture history and social history through time. They represent how people live, or how people would like to live, how people imagine living. So that's the first genre. The second are construction toys. They are constituted of different parts and with no predetermined scheme. So it's mainly modules or little buildings out of which you will build a larger town. And the third genre are the so-called city building games. They also exist in digital form. Actually, each of those genres exists in digital form as well. But the city building games exist as board games, and they represent the structure of a city in a simplified and abstract form, and step by step you build up an urban landscape following certain rules.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that each of the analog games also have its representation in the digital world, but they both have sort of the same value in terms of this educational value. I mean, education not in terms of like teaching people something very specific, but at least representing the current status of things, right? Like in Monopoly board game, you can I think people who are not related to architecture or urbanism in any way, they do learn a little bit more about, I mean, they learn that it's all about money, for sure, but also about some basic structures of the urban developments. I was also thinking about The Sims. Maybe I'm forcing some ideas here, but it seemed to me like on a bigger scale, you do actually learn much more about, well, not only aesthetics, but of how to put forms together, how much space you need for specific rooms. You can also play with different styles there. Do you think it also has a value in that sense? Do these games actually help architecture in that sense or not necessarily?
If they help architecture, I don't know. What is clear is that for any game, no matter if it's analog or digital, it's clear that the game developer has made certain choices, and those choices are not necessarily visible at first sight. But when you start looking at it more closely, you discover that the game developer has put certain ideas, certain concepts, certain ideologies in the game, and in that sense, The Sims is a good example. There will be an example in the exhibition in Amsterdam that closely relates to The Sims, and it's actually a reflection on The Sims that was made by an artist who expected very much, he had high expectations of the very first version of The Sims that was in 1999. The name of the artist is John Haddock, and he was really waiting for this game. He expected it to be a very broad and open way to simulate living in general in any kind of place. And when he discovered the game, he was very disappointed, actually. He was disappointed by its extreme focus on consumerism, by its kind of narrow-mindedness, by its lack of socially and politically relevant themes. So he decided to do kind of the opposite. And what he created were 20 screenshots. He calls them isometric screenshots. That's the title of the work, which will be visible at Archon. And those screenshots were all created in the same graphic style as The Sims. But what you can see in those screenshots are very relevant and traumatic events out of world history. Like key events in world history. That's a way how to question the games and how to question the ideas that are inside that you maybe don't notice when you're not aware.
Yeah, because I think that really the game designer's responsibility is quite huge. Like in the end, like you're saying, depending on how they design the game, both board game and digital game, it really influences in the end the way how people start thinking about things. Because if you have just a selection of options, you start thinking these are the only options, right? Like in The Sims, the question was how big of a swimming pool I make.
Yeah. I used to play The Sims a lot when I was younger, and I read later that it was also supposed to be kind of a critique to consumerism, but I didn't get that at all. And in The Sims, when you had a more expensive bed, you would need less hours of sleep, or you had a more expensive toilet, you would pee faster. And I really had thought for years that was actually true. That so yeah, it influenced me a lot. And I made all these houses in themes. So I had this medieval house and this romantic house, and I thought that is what an architect does. It turns out to be a bit more complicated, but
yeah, and there is no shortcut to get more money, unfortunately, in real life. So if we could actually go one step further in understanding what kind of value games could bring even more, what do you think it could be? Because I already started being more aware of like gender-free toys for kids. And it still seems like, I mean, I don't want to focus just on sexism, but it does seem like especially digital games, there is a lot of that still. Like when you can choose the character that you want to play with, it's very clear what's the image of a male one and what's the image of the female one. But there could be, I do believe that designers of games could have a bigger impact on people, on the way how people think, and also maybe starting a change. Could we maybe brainstorm a little bit on that? Which issues we could tackle with games, both analog and digital?
Well, looking at digital games, there was recently a huge discussion by Sarkeesian and by others, and that really shows that those themes touch nerve. And also the wide range of this discussion shows again the importance of gaming culture. And what happened is that this discussion generates indie games or niche games because people don't recognize themselves in the mainstream, in the bigger games. So they start creating niche games where they do recognize themselves. And that is where the interesting stuff happens, also spatially and architecturally. Because the big mainstream games are getting a bit more standardized, and then these niche games is where stuff happens that makes you think, wait, this is also possible.
Melanie, do you want to add something to it?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of what games can contribute to architecture or to changing how things are, one of the key things is that in a game you can play a different role from the role that you play in real life. So that's a very important thing. You can step into somebody else's role. You can change perspectives. You can watch things from another side, and you can try things out without taking any risks. So it's that's a really important thing that opens up, and that's even more when various people do that at the same time and switch roles. And maybe even there's the concept of collaborative games, which is relatively recent. Collaborative games started to emerge in the last 15 to maximum 20 years. Games where you all play together and you can only win together instead of playing against one another. So if you have a collaborative game concept where also the different people have different roles with different skills, and you have to collaborate and everyone has to contribute something special with his own special skills, those concepts are really interesting on a social level. And I think the other thing is in terms of construction and visualizing constructions and visualizing how constructions are growing, is that especially for non-architects, how do you visualize that? So architects have their own more classic or conventional tools to do so, but those tools are not always easily understandable for non-architects. And those tools can be kind of expanded and made more accessible, more playful, graspable, and even now with hybrid game concepts where you have an analog element and a digital component that are connected, there also you get new opportunities. Thinking about smart blocks or even construction blocks which have a QR code somewhere that is filmed by a camera. You move blocks around on a game board, the camera films what the blocks are doing, and those moves are registered, and there is an app that gives you feedback then. That creates, I mean, that's a field that is still very much in development, but there are really interesting examples of that already, some of which that we will also show at Archon. And that's a really important thing in creating bridges between architects, urbanists, and the whole world around them.
Yeah, I think in this field of sort of bringing digital and analog together, we can also think then about AR and VR, right? Can we imagine if these two fields or general digitalization of games went even further to the architectural world itself? Could we then imagine that at some point everyone's wearing special glasses and can choose colors of everything we're seeing. You can choose yourself what you see. So it's all augmented, and that the architectural world and the architectural design maybe doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah, I've been hearing that, like we've been hearing that for years, that in a couple of years, all we need is a white room and a headset, and we won't need physical architecture anymore. But what you see now is the opposite happening, is physical space is becoming more colorful and exciting because you have to compete with these digital spaces, right? So you see it in restaurants, for example. Maybe 20 years ago, you could run a restaurant by just serving good food and having tables with white tablecloth. And now restaurants, especially in cities, have all these concepts that are carried out in the menu, in the interior design, sometimes even in the clothing of the staff, in the food. So it's this whole experience where you go to. Otherwise, you could just stay in bed with your VR glasses on and order food. Another thing where you see it is that everybody thought professional gamers, so people who game as their job, wouldn't need a physical space because their work is online. They could just meet online and work online. But we're now realizing our second professional gaming facility, so that shows that especially those people whose work is online, they just want to be together in a physical, very well designed environment. So it's kind of a paradox, right? That the physical world is becoming more interesting and colorful because of this digital world.
Yeah, and I think this is actually because I think the key word in this whole discussion is playfulness, and games are made to enjoy them, to have fun. And then that's also often the aim of architects, to design spaces that are playful. And if we could learn something from game designers and from the games themselves, and try to create some kind of set of rules for architecture and for architects to design spaces, what would it be? How could we link these two worlds in order to have architecture then more playful?
I think looking at video game designers can be very interesting because architects have this education where they've learned how it's done. And video game designers, well, now there are schools, but there didn't used to be. So they come up with a lot of fresh ideas how to design a space. So you're already talking about personalizing the space and changing in space. So that is quite common in video games. For example, Monument Valley, where you have to go from A to B and change the space to get there. And physical architecture can be quite static, but it could be an easy element to have movable blocks or movable elements for users to personalize that space. I think another thing we can learn from game designers is the lack of unity of style. Architects are taught that a building should have a concept, so all the floors should have more or less the same look, and that can be super boring. Like you enter an office building and with every floor you feel you've already been there because they're all the same. And in video games, for example, World of Warcraft, you enter into this completely different world all the time. You're in a city, then you're in a forest, you enter a tree, in the tree is a hotel, in the hotel are more trees. So that makes you want to go on and explore what more is there. Something else are transitions. In a game like Superliminal, nothing is what it seems. So you see a painting and then it turns out to be a hallway. And in modern architecture, we've learned that form should follow function. So the forms should tell you what it is. But it can be much more interesting when the space keeps surprising you. And that used to be quite common, actually, before modern times. In Amsterdam, there is this Canal House Museum van Loon, where you see a door and it's not actually a door, and the piece of wall next to it that you can open, and that is a door, and what seems to be a door is a fake door. So interesting spaces like that have already existed for a long time in architecture, but we kind of forgot about it.
I'm thinking about mainly one thing, a book that's title is The Grasshopper, and it's a philosophical book that tries to kind of define what playfulness is, what games are, what games do. And one of the really interesting things that comes out of that is that usually in a game you have a certain goal, and the author takes as an example, he takes golf playing, and the goal of golf playing is that you get the ball into hole, actually. Very simple. But the easiest way to do so would be to just take the ball and bring it into the hole. But what we do in a game is that we create a number of unnecessary obstacles that don't make any sense in a way. But that's what makes it funny to play. That's what makes it enjoyable and also challenging and nice. That's what games are about. And that this kind of absurd situation that we all agree to in a game to do something in a way that is entirely inefficient, but this inefficiency is what is so special and what makes us want to play. It makes enthusiastic also, and and something happens in the course of so doing. And in certain cases, you can also, sometimes you learn something, or in certain cases, it can be an eye opener, or it can make you change perspectives. And I think that's also closely related to architecture, that it's sometimes the most interesting way is not necessarily the most efficient or the most straightforward way. Sometimes obstacles are needed in order to make something happen.
Yeah, I was reading recently about what kind of psychological tricks IKEA is using in their buildings. It's not about the most efficient way to go from A to B, or from this one candle that you have to buy, or this one whatever you have to buy. You actually have to go through all the rooms. Mm-hmm. It's like a labyrinth of places that you're then stopped in order to get interested in something else that you actually have not needed at all. So I think architects use it a little bit, but in a rather, I would be quite even critical about that sometimes we're doing it against people's will. But if we could actually use it, like you're saying, to learn more things, like I think that's the main principle of designing exhibitions, right? It's more of a journey through the building with different experiences from which you can then learn more.
Yeah, and it's a thought that that can not only be applied to the routing, but also to the process of making architecture itself. Also in that sense, how does architecture come about? Also there are different ways to make architecture or to let architecture emerge. And also there, efficiency maybe doesn't need to be the highest priority.
I think the golf course is a very good example, because you could also just golf on a concrete field, but these are beautifully designed spaces that people love to be in. Like in video games, you can also drive a car through a wide environment or shoot a wide block, but usually video games have an elaborate architecture behind it. So yeah, in IKEA, it's probably used to sell stuff, but that doesn't necessarily have to be like that. And it shows, like Melanie said, that it's not only about the functionality, and also maybe less than before, because before you would need an office because that's where your work was. You had to go there because your phone was there and your pile of paper, so it was very functional. But now when you go to an office, you could also work at home or at a bar or whatever. And when you go there, you want to go to a space that is interesting and not only functional.
That's very true. I think that's something that's like, this change is already slowly happening, right? Maybe even more after COVID, where we realize how much of physical spaces and of different spaces that stimulate us in different ways we need. If we could go back for a second to a more standard way of thinking about games and architecture, to what extent architects can also use games, both the physical games, board games, doll houses, etc., and the digital games?
Well, if you talk about really applied games that are or either applying existing games specifically to design processes, or developing games specifically to be used for design processes, very often it's about participation. It's about including other groups of people into this process. And the thing that I mentioned before, this aspect of visualization. If you can visualize something in an understandable way, then that allows other people to join in and to talk about it and to bring in their ideas and perspective, their own priorities. at Arkham we will show a very recent game that was developed, I think, 2 years ago. Which is about water management. I mean, it's not specifically architecture, but it's very, very closely related to architecture, of course, in the Netherlands. And that's one of those very innovative hybrid games with an analog and a digital component. So it consists of a wooden game board, which represents an abstract river landscape. It's built out of hexagonal tiles, which you can move, and each of these tiles has a different function, and the function is indicated with a color and a symbol, and it's easily recognizable also for non-specialists. And they also have different heights, because the heights is of course an important issue when you're talking about water management. And those tiles can be moved, and it's quite a spectacular installation. Under the table is a camera, and the camera films the movement of the tiles, and this information is going into the software part of the game. And then on a screen, you can see that same landscape as virtual architecture, and you can see the same movements on the screen, and the screen is giving you information and feedback on the moves that you're doing on the game board, and it shows you the consequences of the interventions you do on the game board. Consequences in terms of course, finances, but also ecology, and different factors. And you get missions you get a situation described, and you get a mission. For instance, you need to enlarge the river, or you have to change its course, or whatever. And the game is giving you feedback about what you're doing. So I think that's quite a wonderful game, actually. Wonderful also in terms of it's very beautifully made, and it has a lot of potential, and it's very innovative, and it brings people together around that table, talking with each other about a theme, which actually is in a way abstract and difficult to understand, because it's based on huge databases and models and expertise, and that's normally just engineers would understand.
Yeah, but at the same time, actually, these topics are taken into the board games, and now I'm thinking, well, even the Monopoly, right? Like, this is quite an abstract thing for a regular person to think about.
Yeah.
Yet it became such a popular game that people actually enjoy playing and enjoy building their environments, that they learned so much about very, very specific topic. So in that case, water is also one of them. And so maybe, also the way to tackle some of these issues is also maybe by just linking topics with each other. For example, in the Monopoly, maybe every 10 house you build, you get an extra risk card, which is telling you about floods because of too many concrete houses being built in one plot. Like, that there are games that just focus on a very specific thing, but maybe sometimes by linking the issues, you could also just raise awareness and build sort of worldviews on such topics.
Yeah, you mentioned Monopoly a few times now. There's quite a number of reinterpretations of Monopoly existing also, or critical versions of Monopoly, kind of because the classic Monopoly is very capitalistic, and maybe not a very nice concept, but there are quite a number of reinterpretations existing. And I'm thinking of one example that was created in the French city of Marseille in the south of France, which was created to make people aware of terrible living circumstances in that very city, of people living almost in slums in certain parts of Marseille, in a country that you would consider as rich and developed. And what they did in their reinterpretation is that they changed all the streets, and they used only addresses of really terrible places to live in, really existing streets and houses in Marseille. And that happened after one building had even collapsed, yes, and people had died. And so they created that game to make to make people aware. And the game rules were exactly the same as in the original game, but you were only allowed to buy after having read newspaper articles, reports, documentaries, and so about those terrible living circumstances. And if you were then still willing to make money out of that, it was kind of very ethical and yeah. And it was they did manage to, or at least make people aware. It was quite a successful game. We also show it at Hoorn.
Yeah, I'll definitely go back to the exhibition itself. But something that you mentioned before about the participatory value of using games, that also reminded me of actually using a Pokemon Go game once in my research. We basically asked a group of people to download the app, and then we were walking through Delft at that point, trying to catch Pokemons. And then there were also, I think, these gyms where you could, which were very specifically chosen by the designers of the game, that had a very, that had either a cultural or architectural value to the city itself, which was actually quite interesting for me. So you just ended up in the middle of a random street, and then it turned out there is this very interesting building in front of you that you could click on, and you could see like a little bit of a fun fact story about it. And I think like the topic of the workshop of this research was what public space is and how do we define public spaces. And I think, just by inviting people and sitting at the table and discussing this topic, this would definitely not bring the same value as having this gaming experience or this playing experience together, and by being on the spot discussing then how these places make us feel. So here I have a question to Dafne, as an architect and someone fascinated by digitalization also in architecture. Do you see yourself or the practice where you work now using more of games in participatory process, or these digital methods of designing in your processes?
Yeah, no, what we use a lot are these 3D programs where you can walk through your future house or future building in 3D and experiencing the space. Like you already said, it's very hard for people to imagine their future house just by looking at floor plans, and it's even harder for them to imagine a future neighborhood. Like, what do you answer when an architect or an architect asks what kind of neighborhood do you want? You have no idea, it's too big. Or like with the water example that Melanie had, it's too complicated. So they're visualizing it and having people walk through the space. They can make these decisions in a much more easy way together with other people before it's being built. So we use that a lot. Yeah.
Since you work for AHA, do you also try to use this games in the participatory processes when it comes to designing schools for kids?
Yeah, very much. Yeah. In that, I think gaming facilities in schools and buildings like this are very similar, actually, though you won't expect it. Schools, when you see a high school, there are 16-year-olds. And they maybe much rather stay at home and play a video game than go to school. They go there, of course, because they have to go there. But what if you design a space where they actually want to go, where they feel like going? And so one thing you can do is take these ideas from game designers, but another thing you could do is involve them in the process of making this school with these participatory games, VR, AR, and then they get involved in the process, and you end up with a school that is much more what they would imagine to be their school like.
Yeah, that sounds really, really cool. And I think this brings us then to the topic of the exhibition. So actually the whole starting point of how I found both of you, which is the exhibition organized by Arkham Architecture Center in Amsterdam, which is going to tackle the whole topic of the relationship between games and architecture. So the exhibition is going to open on the 10th of December. It's going to be there till May the 28th. So I would like to ask you what your experience in designing this exhibition, curating this exhibition was. So how did this experience for you to actually start it, and what your roles were in this specific exhibition at Arkham?
So shall I start, Dafne? So I was, as a curator, I was mainly responsible for the content, and I wanted, on the one hand, to allow visitors to become more aware of the messages and representations hidden in game concepts. Then, since Arkham is a local architecture center, it's really important to connect the exhibition to themes that are important in this very city. So we created a completely new unit in the exhibition that was not in the exhibition in Vienna, for instance, which is very specifically about how Amsterdam appears in various games. So I collected about, I think, 20 different games, board games, construction games, all kinds of games related to Amsterdam. And it's really interesting to watch through the glasses of games, what image do we get of this town? So that's the thing. And of course, I mean, we don't visitors only to reflect on games. We of course want them to play themselves. So there's quite a number of playable exhibits in this exhibition as well. Both showing regular games like you could just buy in a toy shop, the dolls' houses, the board games, the construction toys that we know. But also, of course, because it's an architecture center, very much making the link to what games can mean for architectural practice. So those are, I think, the main thematic focuses. And then Dafne was responsible for the design.
Yes, I was.
And not only, because you also show your own work.
Yeah, I show a couple of 3 buildings that are examples of architecture that are inspired by games. And I designed the exhibition, and here I tried to apply the principles that I was just talking about in architecture to an exhibition, which I've never done before. But why do you want to go there, right? So if you have just images of buildings or of games, you can as well stay at home and see them on your computer. So all the things that are exhibited are physical. You can walk around them. Sometimes you can touch them or play with them, so they're very tangible. And I've designed the exhibition also with this idea in mind that this is this space you can keep exploring. So it will be kind of a labyrinth-like experience where you have to find your way through this world of curtains, and you see a stair where you emerge into this other world. So it's going to be very much a space that you want to experience physically and is colorful like a video game.
That sounds really cool, and I think we actually made a great introduction to the exhibition itself, but also to the whole topic of the relationship between games and architecture. Again, the exhibition is going to start on the 10th of December this year, 2022. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you, Magda.
Thank you, Magda.
Yes, it's nice.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to share your thoughts on the topic, just find me on Instagram at 4dbrainstorm, or simply send an email to 4dbrainstorm@gmail.com. I'm happy to keep discussing it further. If you're interested to know more about what I do, you can also check out 4dbrainstorm.com, a platform for free brainstorming in all dimensions and fields. Join the brainstorm and let's discover the 4th dimension together. Till next time!